Welcome to the Podkey summary of maritime fur trade. Today's story is about a fur trade that was never just about fur. It tied the Pacific Northwest and Alaska to China, Hawaii, Britain, the United States, and eventually places as far off as Tasmania and New Zealand, turning sea otters and beavers into fuel for global commerce, imperial rivalry, and huge local upheaval. It made some merchants absurdly rich, helped push New England money toward early industry, reshaped indigenous politics and power, and tore through animal populations so thoroughly that whole ecosystems changed with them. It's one of those histories where trade, empire, environment, and everyday survival are all tangled together. The Pacific maritime fur trade can sound niche at first, but it really operated like a worldwide commercial loop. Furs taken on the northwest coast were sold in Qing China for tea, silk, porcelain, sugar, and other goods, and those goods then moved onward into Atlantic markets. American merchants became especially good at this with what got called the Golden Round ships. Left Boston, went around Cape Horn with trade goods, swapped those goods for furs on the northwest coast, spent the winter in Hawaii, sold the furs in Canton, and then headed home through the Indian Ocean carrying Chinese cargo. The wild part is that profits could stack up at three different moments. Merchants made money selling the original cargo, then again by turning furs into Chinese goods, and then one more time selling those goods back in the United States. This trade produced returns that sound almost made up. Cook's expedition reportedly realized something like an 1,800% profit after discovering how much Chinese buyers wanted sea otter pelts. American voyages in the early 19th century sometimes brought in 300 to 500% returns, and in exceptional cases more than 2,200% before all costs were fully counted. When people talk about speculative booms, this is the kind of thing they mean. That money didn't just sit on the coast or stay on ships. It helped move New England capital, in the old phrase, from wharf to waterfall, from ocean trading ventures into water-powered textile mills. So a trade built partly on otter skins also fed the rise of industrial manufacturing in New England. And with that came growing demand for southern cotton. One oceanic trade route ended up plugged directly into the early American industrial economy. The competition around this trade was commercial, but it was also unmistakably imperial. Russia got there early in the north and imposed yasak, a fur tribute, on Aleut and Aleutian hunters. And that wasn't a relationship between equal trading partners. It relied on coercive labor and hostages, and later the Russian-American company operated as a state-backed monopoly modeled in part on outfits like the East India Company and Hudson's Bay Company. Britain, Spain, Russia, and the United States all used trade as a way to reinforce territorial claims. The seizure of British ships at Nootka Sound in 1789 triggered an international crisis, which tells you how quickly commerce could become geopolitics. Later agreements helped freeze some of those rivalries into borders. The 1824 Russo-American Treaty and the 1825 Anglo-Russian Convention made 54 degrees 40 minutes a major boundary between Russian and British spheres. And exploration mattered here too, because traders were often the ones doing the mapping. The northwest coast was a maze of islands, fjords, fog, currents, rocks, and tricky winds, so commercial voyages ended up charting places like the Strait of Juan de Fuca, Queen Charlotte Strait, Gray's Harbor, and the Columbia River. Robert Gray's entry into the Columbia in 1792 became more than a navigational achievement. It gave the United States a geographic argument for later claims in the Pacific Northwest, which is a good reminder that a ship looking for profit could also be carrying the first draft of a border. Indigenous peoples were absolutely central to this system. Their hunting skills, local knowledge, trade routes, and bargaining power made the whole maritime trade possible in the first place. Foreign traders were competing with one another, and coastal communities used that competition to demand better prices and choose among buyers. Inland furs also moved to the coast through indigenous networks, so the trade depended on native systems that were already there. But the influx of wealth and imported goods changed local politics fast. Firearms, metal tools, textiles, and new concentrations of wealth intensified warfare, slavery, and the spread of potlatching. Wealth also let new elites challenge hereditary chiefs, and that pushed traditional nobility to reinforce authority through ancestry names, totems, crests, and increasingly elaborate potlatches. So the trade didn't just add goods to existing societies, it changed the terms of status and power inside them. Those early advantages didn't last indefinitely. Epidemics, especially smallpox, along with alcohol, slave trading, land seizure, and forced relocation, brought severe population loss and steadily undermined indigenous sovereignty. For a while, American traders dominated the southern northwest coast, especially from the 1790s through the 1820s. Their ships were flexible and globally diversified, so they could absorb losses in one place, unload surplus trade goods at high prices somewhere else, and mix fur trading with California, Hawaiian, Pacific Island, and Russian provisioning ventures. In the long run, though, the Hudson's Bay Company wore them down. It didn't beat American rivals because the short-term math looked prettier. It won through scale, endurance, and a willingness to pay inflated prices and accept substantial long-term losses in order to intercept interior beaver shipments and lock up coastal access. By about 1837 to 1841, American traders had mostly abandoned the coast. The old system was weakening anyway. As animal populations fell, markets turned shakier, and the broader commercial world got less forgiving. The Panic of 1825, the China trade crisis of 1826 and 1827, the Panic of 1837, falling tea and fur prices, and competition from other commodities all chipped away at the trade. Once the animals were harder to find and the margins got thinner, the whole machine stopped looking so magical. The ecological side of this story is brutal. Sea otters may have numbered somewhere around 150,000 to 300,000 before large-scale commercial hunting, but they reproduced slowly, which made them especially vulnerable. By the mid-19th century, they were nearly gone from most of the northwest coast, surviving mainly around the Aleutians and California. Even now, the species remains endangered or at risk. Beaver trapping caused a different kind of damage. Beavers aren't just animals in a pelt market, they're ecosystem engineers. Their dams help store water and support wetlands, fish, otters, bears, and a whole chain of connected life. When beavers were removed, some populations took centuries to recover, and the landscapes changed with them, including increased drought and long-lasting habitat loss. The Southern Ocean fur seal trade followed much the same arc too, peaking around the 1810s and becoming unprofitable by 1863 because the rookeries had been overexploited. It's a familiar pattern, honestly. Extraordinary profits arrive first, and the bill shows up later in animals, water, and entire ecosystems. The trade also left behind permanent footholds and mixed communities around the Pacific. There were Russian settlements in Alaska and California, British forts along the coast, and strong Hawaiian participation in shipping and labor. So even after the fur boom faded, the infrastructure of empire, movement, and settlement remained. What started as a commercial hunt for pelts helped build a more durable colonial world. That's the big shape of it. A trade route that made fortunes, fed factories, hardened borders, empowered, and then devastated communities, and emptied coastlines of the animals that made the whole thing run. It's a global story with very local consequences, and the local consequences were often the most permanent. Thanks for listening. Sometimes history really does follow the money, and then keeps going into the water, the forests, and the map. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.